Hey, it's Coach Anderson here from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. We're going to pick up again with Unit 3, Urban America, and Lesson number 6, Segregation in America. Now, we talked about the Gilded Age, of course, in this period in American history, and one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we brought out to you is that we said it was gilded and that was a lot of prosperity for a lot of people, but there were some people that missed out, of course, on that prosperity. And one of the groups that missed out on that prosperity we already talked about, of course, was the American farmer. But there were also African Americans that missed out, of course, on this particular prosperity of the Gilded Age also. So even though it looked good on the outside, didn't necessarily mean that America, of course, was all that on the inside. You're going to focus questions, why do people migrate? And then how is urban life different from rural life? And once again, we're not answering those questions right now. This is just a guide I thought as we go through the unit. And what we will do, of course, is pick up with the Do Now activity and with a journal topic. And it says, list as many types of discrimination as you can. So what we'll do is give you a few minutes, go through and write your answers, and we'll come back in a few seconds and we'll address them. Okay. Well, discrimination. Well, as long as man's been alive, there's always been somebody, of course, that hasn't been able to enjoy the fruits of society. And in terms of looking at African Americans in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and even 2000s today, and in other groups, of course, like Jews, of course, and other minority groups, there may feel, or anybody really can, of course, experience some type of discrimination. It could be discrimination in terms of housing. It could be in terms of looking at religion. So when we're looking at discrimination, it comes in many forms. It's not just about racial discrimination, but it could be discrimination, of course, that comes as a result of some of the biases. So when we're looking at discrimination, it's important to understand that discrimination is not, it doesn't have a color. It doesn't have a specific group of people, of course, that it targets. Anyone can be the subject, of course, of discrimination. The lesson focus questions for lesson number 6, Segregation in America. What issues did the freedmen face post-Reconstruction in America? And how were the views of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois different? They were two prominent African Americans, of course, that rise to prominence in the late 1800s, and what their different views, of course, for the African American was. Vocabulary, once again, you should go ahead and write these vocabulary words down and define them yourselves. And as we go over, when we see some, we'll try to address them as we go. But go ahead and write those particular words down, of course, and complete them yourself or define them yourself. All right, first we're going to talk about the Black Exodus. Now, after the Civil War was over with, we'll find that a lot of them African Americans, freedmen, of course, will stay in the South, and then there were a lot of them, of course, that will leave. Some of them that stay, of course, become sharecroppers, of course. Since there is no more slavery, there is sharecropping, where basically it becomes legalized slavery from the standpoint that what happens is, freedmen work for, farm owners for a portion of the crop, but because they are so dependent on the farm owner for all the things, of course, that they need to survive, they in essence get tied to the farms without making any real profit on the farms. Well, the Black Exodus was led by Benjamin Pap Singleton, and what he did is he led African Americans from the South to Kansas, specifically to a place called Nicodemus, Kansas. Many who didn't move to Kansas stayed in the South and joined alliances like the Colored Farmers Alliance, which has membership of 1.2 million by 1890. The fear of poor white farmers and black farmers uniting caused many Southern Democrats to enact strategies to inject racism into their relationship to minimize their impact on democratic society. One of the things that poor whites, of course, in the South didn't recognize, and poor blacks in the South didn't recognize, is they had a lot in common. And with them, if they had ever united, they could have evoked some real change, of course, in the South. And it wouldn't, but what happens is Southern Democrats, who were the people that were the landowners and who were the people, of course, in power, they injected racism and set the two groups off against each other. And because of that, the political power that both of those groups could have had, they never were able to achieve. Nicodemus, Kansas. This is where the Exodusters, of course, moved in Kansas. The purpose of segregation, the number one purpose was to minimize the black participation in Southern politics and government. Post-Reconstruction, Southern states passed laws to limit black voting, to end or limit the black vote. They used the poll tax, where you had to pay a fee, of course, to register. The literacy test, where you had to be able to read and understand a particular paragraph so that you could, so that you were competent enough to vote. And then the grandfather clause. Well, the other two, the poll tax and literacy tests, were so good at doing their jobs, it also caused poor whites not to be able to vote. So what they did is they put the grandfather clause in, and by doing that, they said if your grandfather was eligible to vote in election prior to 1860, then you could vote. So if you were white, poor white, whose father was eligible to vote, whether he voted or not, or didn't vote, you still were grandfathered in, and you, of course, could register to have the right to vote. A consequence of the voting restrictions was poor whites who were affected, but the grandfather clause took care of that. The legend of Jim Crow, or legal Jim Crow. Segregation or separation of races existed in North and South, but was more pronounced in the South. Southern states went so far as to make segregation of the races legal with the passage of Jim Crow laws, which legally enforced discrimination. In 1883, the Supreme Court set the stage for legalized segregation when they overturned the Civil Rights Act of 1875 that was passed to guarantee freedmen, civil rights in the Reconstruction period. Plessy v. Ferguson challenged segregation in public facilities in 1896. The Supreme Court put forth the separate but equal doctrine. When you had Homer Plessy, who sued to end segregation of public facilities, but the Supreme Court came back and said that separate but equal, or segregation of races, is fine as long as the facilities are separate and equal. The only problem with that, though, in 1896, is Plessy did set the stage for legal action, but one of the characteristics that you see, of course, of Jim Crow is that you say here's the car for white folks, and then the car for the Jim Crow car for everyone else. And it's separate, but I dare say it's probably not equal. Civil rights activists. The response was led by many, and most with different approaches. The activists against segregation and racial injustice included Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and they all had a specific niche that they had kind of fit into. Ida B. Wells led the crusade against lynching, trying to make it, of course, a federal law, and have the people that engaged in it brought to justice. Mary Church Terrell led the crusade to have black workers, particularly women, get fair wages like their white counterparts. And then you have on the left, Ida B. Wells, and then on the right, Mary Church Terrell. Then you have the two big men of the movement. You have Booker T. Washington on the left, who founded Tuskegee Institute to educate blacks with trade and agricultural skills. He advocated patience in the quest for civil rights instead of preparation, and in preparation for a day when equality was gained through education first. It was something called the Atlanta Compromise. W.E.B. Du Bois rejected the Atlanta Compromise and stated that blacks should demand civil rights now. He wanted the restoration of black voting rights and an end to segregation by using the courts. So, and what he advocates, of course, is use the court system to sue for the rights that the Constitution, of course, and with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, of course, that guaranteed. Civil rights pioneers, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois on the right. Booker T. Washington, of course, the founder of Tuskegee Institute, one of those universities, of course. We talked about social Darwinism and the gospel of wealth. Tuskegee Institute was founded with Booker T. Washington with money provided from, you guessed it, Andrew Carnegie, who endowed Tuskegee. What we have here is an activity, a Venn diagram. What we want you to do is take the Venn diagram that we have listed here and go through, of course, and answer it. And what it does, of course, is it gives us the comparison and the contrast, of course, of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, but it also gives us what the similarities are. So we'll take about 15, 20 minutes, go over, and let you go over and correct or, complete this particular activity, and then we'll come back, of course, and discuss it in a few moments. Okay, you should have enough time that you were able to go through, of course, and look at the Venn diagram on Du Bois, of course, and Booker T. Washington. And what we wanted to do, of course, is to give you a comparison, contrast, and once again, the answer to this can be found at the end of the unit, of course, in the reference slides. But to give you some idea in terms of looking at Du Bois, of course, said that he believed in professional education for black folks. not vocational education. And that's what one of the things that Booker T. Washington advocated, of course, was vocational education to do the jobs, of course, that white Americans, of course, needed us to do, or needed black people to do. And then you had the things where they had in common, where they both were advocates for, an end to segregation. Now, once you leave that particular similarity, there's not a whole lot else that they have in common. But they were two different people, two diametrically opposed ideas in terms of how it is that you go about ending segregation in the Gilded Age, and then throughout the rest of our history. The lesson focus questions, of course, for Unit 3, Lesson 6, Segregation in America. What issues did the freedmen face post-Reconstruction in America, and how were the views of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois different? All right, the issues for the freedmen: voting restrictions, the poll tax, grandfather clause poll, and literacy test. And then intimidation, violence through lynching, Jim Crow laws that legalize segregation, and the decision of the Supreme Court upholding the separate but equal doctrine. And then how were the views of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois different? Well, Washington believed that the road to equality was to be patient and be educated in jobs and vocations valuable to white society. Du Bois believed that blacks should demand equality now, become professionals, and use those positions like lawyers to sue for equality through the courts. Well, once again, this is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online, U.S. History from 1877 to present. And what we try to do, of course, is give you an idea about what we think. But it doesn't matter what we think. What we want you to do, of course, is do your own research, because this is America's history. And since it's America's history, it's your history. So do your own research, reach your own conclusions, and we'll see you next time.